We are absolutely delighted to have Sasha de Vogel, who is here as one of only our second class of postdoctoral fellows at NYU. She has a PhD from the University of Michigan, and she's going to be speaking to us today. So Sasha, I'm going to pass the mic off.
Okay, thank you, Josh. I will. Okay. So while Sasha's doing that, I just wanted to thank everybody at the Jordan Center and at HSE for joining us today. So this is No Final Victories, How Reneging Affects Concessions to Low Capacity Protest Campaigns in Moscow, Russia. It draws on an article that I'm currently working on, as well as some elements from my book project. So I'm really looking forward to hearing your thoughts about this. It's very much a work in progress. So there's a growing recognition in the last few years that there are a range of ways in which authoritarian regimes respond to popular grievances. A lot of this research is being done in China and looks at sort of institutional mechanisms to channel citizens away from protest. But we also know that these modes of authoritarian response can also include protest. And this means that when protests occur, they're going to take those grievances into account in policies. They're going to use concessions. So concessions are a form of meeting demands to protest. There actually isn't a agreed upon definition of concessions, but usually we think of them as sort of the benefits that are kind of the opposite of repression when it comes to responding to protest. Now, most theories of concession assume that concessions are made to high capacity protest campaigns that are sort of active enough to disrupt the political status quo and create conditions where repressing them really wouldn't be feasible or practical for the government. But if we're looking at protests and concessions as a mode of authoritarian responsiveness, we're going to have to make concessions to protest campaigns that are lower capacity, that don't have the ability to do that. So concessions are what's going to allow the government to respond either in fact and in reality respond, or to respond in appearance alone to the grievances that cause protests. And that can happen even if protests are low capacity. So low capacity protest campaigns, these are campaigns that lack resources. They're less professionalized, so they might be run by ordinary citizens doing this in their private time as opposed to political activists. They're usually holding, or sort of characteristically holding, fewer or smaller events. They might actually struggle to put together a demonstration at all. And they attract less media attention. Yes.
So the campaigns are the protests that people are making.
Yeah.
And
so
concessions is the government. When you say theories of concessions, do you mean the conditions under which the government would make a concession?
Yes. So what I'm referring to there are sort of social movement studies and also more generally studies of protest, how they view concessions as arising and what the purpose is the government is using them for, and also what effect they're having on protest movements, social movements, protesters. So sort of all of those theories tend to agree that concessions are a type of meeting demands. Sometimes they refer to it as accommodation or facilitation of the protest demands. There isn't really a solidly agreed upon definition of exactly how concessions are operating in those various domains. Does that answer your question?
And the low capacity campaigns, the campaigns here refer to protest.
Yes. So
low capacity protest or social movement.
Yes, exactly. So the campaigns are a series of actors coming together to organize protests to make demands of the government. So it's a little bit lower capacity than a social movement would be. Social movements tend to be sort of national or very widespread in scope. These are a little bit smaller than those, involving fewer actors and just more sort of delimited in their demands. Okay, so looking at these low capacity protest campaigns and looking at concessions, in Russia, the case that I'm using here is interesting because the Putin regime is not usually considered responsive to protest. As I mentioned, a lot of that research on authoritarian responsiveness is being done in China. There are a couple of unique features about the Chinese regime. We don't really know exactly how this works in other settings. We also know that in Russia, civic protest has actually been increasing in recent years. And we know that performance legitimacy, or the ability to deliver governance outcomes, is really important to regime legitimacy there, as well as in the rest of the former Soviet Union. So it seems like a good case where we could be seeing concessions to lower capacity protest. At the same time, we have few studies of less politicized campaigns in Russia. A lot of the work on protests there looks at highly politicized, often electoral protests. Those are actually very unlikely to get concessions, especially in Russia. Sam Green has done a study of some civic campaigns, and this is a case study of a series of movements from a couple of years ago, and he finds that the state's response to these campaigns is unpredictable and appears, in fact, deliberately unpredictable to prevent them from kind of learning from past experiences. So to shed light on this in Russia, I collected a data set of municipal level campaigns in Moscow, Russia. So these are campaigns that targeted the government of the city of Moscow with concerns that the government had the authority to correct or to address. So this is a data set, which I'll describe in greater detail later, of 66 campaigns that were active between 2013 and 2018. So just to give you some examples here, in the top left corner, this is a protest campaign in the Ramenki neighborhood of Moscow against the plan to build a road through a public park. We have some gentlemen who work in snow removal who were on strike over their working conditions and pay. And we have a protest campaign in the Mitino neighborhood of Moscow against a planned construction of an apartment building in a park. And then last, we have some parents who are protesting an issue with the registration of children in kindergartens. So despite the fact that, as I just said, Russia is not usually considered a regime that's responsive to protest, actually 3 out of 4 of these campaigns got more than one concession. The only campaign that didn't get any concessions was the parents protesting kindergarten registration. And actually, my data shows that the city of Moscow during this 5-year period actually made a concession on average once every 2 weeks to these low capacity protest campaigns. And again, this is happening despite the fact that for half of the campaigns in my data set, they were only able to attract on average 100 people to a demonstration. Several of them actually never managed to hold a demonstration. They were using other tactics that required smaller numbers of people. And for all of the campaigns in this data set, on average, they only held 12 protest events during this 5-year period. And actually, most of them got concessions in the first couple of events, so before they even hit that average or hit their max. So it seems like from this that potentially protest is a good way for citizens in Moscow, at least, to hold the government accountable, to force it to take their opinions into account in its policies. However, we need to take into account that concessions are fundamentally a promise of future action. Unlike repression, which is pretty easy and often executed at protests, concessions happen, they're often promised after the protest ends, and that promise usually entails a commitment to implement a policy change that will take weeks or sometimes even months to fully realize. They're not instantaneous events. It is possible that if the government later prefers not to implement that promise, it will choose not to. And in that case, the low capacity protest campaigns in particular, there's really potentially very little they can do to hold the government to account because they struggle to stay mobilized, they struggle to remobilize once they have suspended protest. And in general, obviously citizens and autocracies have fairly limited means to compel the government to listen to their demands. So in other words, what we have here is a credible commitment problem. Credible commitment problems we know are well studied in autocracies, usually between the elite and the autocrat. And in that context, we theorize that the credible commitment problems are resolved with institutions. These are usually democratic seeming institutions that are perverted to authoritarian aims. And of course, that fundamentally makes it impossible for the public to use those same institutions to hold the ruling group, the autocrats and the elites together, accountable for their commitments. And as Asimoglu and Robinson have pointed out, you need democratic institutions to make these kinds of promises to the masses, especially when they're occurring during episodes of collective action. They're looking at revolutionary movements there, so it's a bit of a different situation. But you need those democratic institutions to make these promises credible. Okay. And this means that reneging, or the deliberate failure to implement a concession as promised, may undermine these concessions to low capacity protests. And indeed, my data shows that 45% of the concessions that the Moscow city government promised had a negligible effect on real world policy and behavior within 2 years. So the question I'm asking in this paper here is, to what extent do concessions to low capacity protests actually impact policy? And why are some concessions to these protest campaigns implemented while others are undermined by reneging? Okay, so moving into the theory of this paper. So concessions are a form of conflict resolution or attempted conflict resolution. That conflict resolution, I'm going to argue, can take two main forms. The first is one-off, what I'm going to call one-off conflict resolution. This mouse is really troubling me. And these are forms of concession that really only address the given conflict that protest is happening around. These concessions don't affect different actors in the government or settings beyond the given conflict. So they're not affecting, as I said, other government actors, other independent actors who might be, in the sort of related spheres to that conflict, but not party to the conflict. And I'll give some examples in a second. And they're also not affecting the realm of the current conflict in the future. So they don't prevent conflict from reoccurring. So as an example, there are a lot of protests in Moscow about labor disputes with the city. So for example, wage theft. If a concession giving to these protests promises they're going to investigate wage theft, it only addresses that particular instance of wage theft. We're not changing the law so that wage theft doesn't occur in other situations. It doesn't affect individuals who were not affected by that particular instance of wage theft. It doesn't compel people who are guilty of wage theft in other settings to pay back wages. And it also doesn't prevent people at that enterprise from engaging in wage theft in the future. As another example, there are a lot of protests in Moscow about land use and construction, development of construction. You might hold a community meeting to get feedback from local residents. That is a fairly common concession. It only affects people living in that neighborhood who are concerned with that particular issue, but it doesn't prevent that conflict from recurring in the future. There's no reason why they can't initiate another another plan to develop that particular area after that meeting. It doesn't constrain their future behavior in any way. And by their future behavior there, I mean people in the government who are trying to rezone that land or private developers who are trying to develop it. So these are one-off conflict resolution. On the other hand, you can use concessions to create what I'm going to call a constraining resolution to the conflict, and that's going to address the underlying cause of the grievance, potentially at a systemic level. So these types of concessions or types of resolution affect individuals who are not immediately party to the conflict. So they're going to constrain the behavior of people in government or other actors outside of that present conflict. They're also going to potentially prevent that conflict from recurring in the future at that same location. So for example, instead of just investigating wage theft, changing labor law, potentially creating a commission or investigative committee to pay more attention to those types of violations in the future. That would affect not just that one site where the wage theft occurred, but everywhere that would be monitored by such a group. Looking at the land use issue, rezoning the contested site so that it's permanently protected. That building is a historical site, that park is permanently protected green space. So in the future, that conflict can't reoccur over that particular plot of land. So I'm going to argue here that state agents who make concessions are doing so with sort of two priorities. They want to demobilize protest, and then they also want to minimize the impact of the concession that they're making beyond the given conflict. So they can do that using these modes of one-off resolution that can satisfy the demands of protesters in some cases. On the other hand, they can also promise a constraining concession, which would seem to go against their second priority of minimizing the impact beyond the given conflict. But the promise of one of these concessions, separate from its actual implementation, can undermine mobilization or disrupt mobilization. And that can happen, I think, especially among lower capacity protest campaigns, because there is a lot of lower capacity protest campaigns. The people who are participating in them have really heterogeneous beliefs about how trustworthy the government is or how to interpret the promise of a concession. So some members of these campaigns understand these promises as being non-credible, something the government may or may not do. They really don't mean anything to some members of these campaigns. To others, they see them as real resolution to their grievance. They understand them as a sign that protests should be suspended or potentially stopped in general. Others might take kind of a bargaining approach to it, that we should suspend protests, which is very difficult for these campaigns to sustain anyway, and see what the government does next under perhaps the false belief that they can start up protests again when the government needs a little bit more motivation to make good on its promises.
Yeah, can you say just a little more, unless you're going to talk about this more in a minute, like what makes something a constraining concession? Because I thought the puzzle was that autocrats can't credibly commit to doing things in the future because they're autocrats. And so it seems like we're now solving the puzzle by changing the nature of the puzzle, which is saying, well, sometimes they can credibly commit to doing it.
Yeah, I'm going to talk about that more in the rest of the presentation, but I'm making a distinction here between what they say they will do and what they are actually going to do. So when I'm going to argue, I think actually if I press this button, I'm going to argue that when they make these promises of constraining their behavior in the future, these promises are actually not credible, and they're going to renege on them in the future. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I mean, we can listen more on that. We have another question from Tara. Can you unmute Tara? Tara, you want to ask a question?
Yeah, sorry, I'm on video. So this is really interesting. I wanted to know a little bit more about sort of, is there a role for another actor? For example, the employer that's withholding wages, or the developer that's trying to like build something new. And in sort of this process of implementation of these concessions, and is there sort of a difference between these one-off resolutions and constraining concessions in terms of the costs imposed on the third actor? And should we think about the third actor in terms of, whether these things are ultimately implemented or successful?
So I'm going to talk a little bit more about this sort of at the end of the presentation. Trying to quantify the costs of any of these concessions is exceedingly difficult, in part because we are dealing with a system that has a lot of corruption. So even when you, basically a lot of different actors involved in these conflicts stand to gain income from graft, depending on whether or not these projects proceed, that makes it very difficult to quantify exactly what the cost of various concessions are. In terms of the involvement of third-party actors, the labor conflicts that I'm looking at here involve the city of Moscow itself, or contractors like construction companies whose sole client essentially is the city of Moscow or other government clients. So these aren't labor conflicts with private employers for the most part, which means that the city has, in addition to the legal leverage that it has in these labor disputes to compel a third party to or itself to pay, it's also these are essentially part of the government that are violating these labor laws. With developers, they're mainly conflicts where certainly canceling a construction project significantly financially impacts the developer, but for the most part, these conflicts are happening before the development is really underway. And what people are asking for is for the city to do things like rezone or cancel the construction project, which it has the authority to do. So I'm going to talk about the data in more detail in the next section, I think, but these are focusing on conflicts with the city itself. So I'm trying to sort of limit the involvement of third-party actors as much as possible.
And maybe this is related to what Tara asked, but do local citizens sometimes come up with the problems that, with the demands that a regional authority or like local authority cannot resolve because this concerns like changes in like federal legislation, which might be the case in Moscow where some spheres are regulated through the federal legislation?
Yeah, so of course, there are sometimes cases where people are asking the government to do things that it doesn't have the authority to do, but the cases that I've selected for this data set, I've tried to limit that as much as possible based on my knowledge of the protest campaign. So we're just looking at protests about issues that the Moscow city government, as opposed to the federal government or a private entity, has the capacity or the authority to resolve. And I'll talk about the data a little bit more in the next section. Okay.
Denise has a question as well.
Yeah, so can there be a sort of a feedback loop when state actors make a promise, disrupt the low capacity protest, then renege, so people become even more angry, and the low capacity protest sort of grows and becomes a non-low, high capacity protest?
In theory, that is certainly possible. I'm not aware of cases. I don't believe any of the cases in this data set that really happened. There are certainly cases in Russia that I can think of where the government response was highly unsatisfactory to people and that inflamed protest. A lot of the campaigns here, they're really the likelihood that these campaigns can scale into even a citywide movement is really like vanishingly small. There are a lot of, to take the example of construction, these anti-development protests, there are a lot of really contentious sites around the city relating to development. Many of them, although people don't want development there, protest never occurs. In some cases, they only manage to hold 1 or 2 protests. Russians are not really very enthusiastic about protest, and getting people involved in even these neighborhood issues that I think there's actually quite a lot of data to support that people tend to feel pretty passionately about things that are going on in their own backyard, certainly in democracies. These campaigns still really struggle to get people to turn out to protests that are happening even occasionally, to convey to people that there was this development project and then we had a protest and they said they would cancel it, but then like 2 months later, it seems like it's not canceled and there's construction again. And now this is like a betrayal of our trust. To convey that to your neighbors even is very difficult for them. And so although people involved in the campaign, like the core members of the campaign, certainly are extremely upset when reneging happens, it doesn't really have, it doesn't seem to have the sort of a bigger impact outside of that core of organizers. And that's speaking kind of anecdotally as well as from evidence from interviews that I did with activists during field work. Okay, oh, sorry, let me just reestablish here that, so once mobilization is disrupted, even if minorly disrupted, it's quite hard for these campaigns to re-achieve it. And certainly, as I just said, difficult for them to increase it. And this allows the government to renege, or certainly is not providing an obstacle for it to not renege. So I'm going to theorize here that higher constraint concessions are more likely to be followed by reneging. Of course, it's also possible that actions by protesters may influence the implementation of concessions. One way that they might do this is to sustain mobilization after a concession is promised, demonstrate to the government that they're very serious about this issue, that they're not going to, let their guard down while the concession is being implemented, sort of as an attempt to coerce or compel the government into making good on its promises that are not necessarily trustworthy. So perhaps sustained mobilization makes reneging less likely. Okay, so looking at some research design. So part of my theory and my definition of reneging rather is that it is the deliberate failure by the government to implement concessions as promised. Obviously, the word deliberate is doing a lot there. If concessions are not implemented as promised and it's not deliberate, it could be because the state lacks capacity, they don't have the resources, they don't have sort of the political will, a variety of other issues. Those are not the failures that we're interested in or that I'm interested in for this project. I'm interested in the deliberate strategy of not delivering concessions. So to maximize the plausibility that concessions are not being implemented because of a deliberate choice by the government, I need a case that has really high state capacity. And that's what I have selected here with Moscow.
Can I ask something?
Yes.
So reneging, so it seems like the autocrat could negotiate or offer some concession with the intention to renege later, or something changes and then they renege later. You know what I mean? Like the deliberate, I was sort of thinking of this before you started talking about the deliberate assumption. So of those two scenarios that I just sketched out, it seems like you would be looking at both of them, right? You're avoiding this idea that they just can't do it, so it's deliberate, but there's still those two different cases, right? They're always planning to renege versus they were intentionally going to follow through and then something changed later in the calculation.
Sure. So in the data that I collected, I did distinguish between, well, sorry to backtrack for a second. I cannot observe what's going on under the hood of the Moscow city government, unfortunately. It's just not possible to, get data about that, especially given the number of different scenario or protest campaigns that I'm looking at. And also, obviously, given the nature of the political system, is very difficult. We do know that the Russian government uses concessions strategically to diminish or undermine mobilization. We also know that there are clear cases here where they are making completely false promises that they never attempt to implement in any way. The only explanation for which I think is that it's a deliberate choice to do that, and it's happening significantly often in this data. There are also cases where, for example, they might promise a concession, a lower level official might promise a concession, and then a higher level official intervenes. There are a couple of concessions from Putin in this data set where and those sort of have the effect of canceling out all other attempts to resolve a problem. And in those cases, I don't code those concessions as reneging. Those are concessions that are just like the effect is not observed. So cases where there's another concession that eliminates the previous concession, those are not counted as reneging in this data. And I would argue should not be counted as reneging theoretically either.
Okay,
are there like situations that you had in mind specifically?
Well, I'm just thinking about like if there's an organization that's protesting and they offer a concession, but then the leader of the organization changes, for example. And so then the autocrat is like, well, it was really about what you wanted and now you're out for some reason, so I'm not going to follow through. Or something happens in the media at the time, which gets the organization gets some coverage of their protest, even locally. So they make the concession under the assumption that it's fortuitous circumstances right now that mean they're covered by the media, but in the future it's unlikely to happen. So like you said, you couldn't get inside the heads of the city officials, but maybe there is information about the organizations themselves and like who are they led by, or what coverage they get, something that would help you get at this.
That is a good point that I should definitely look into more. Part of the issue with getting really into like a nitty-gritty of a perfect timeline of every activity the campaign engaged in, every event, and the implementation timeline, matching those up is really, really difficult because I have much less information about the implementation of these concessions. And I'll talk a little bit in a minute about how I'm actually keeping track of the implementation. But to put it short, as short as I can, although this answer is quite long already, I can only score the implementation in sort of much larger chunks. So for the first year, I'm doing it quarterly, and then after that, it's yearly, just because it's very difficult to get at a more fine-grained level consistently when the levels of implementation are changing. Okay, so back to Moscow. So Moscow has a lot of local state capacity. It has one of the largest municipal budgets in the world during the period that I'm looking at. It had between 23 and 35 billion US dollars. And actually, I should say the period that I'm looking at here, or sorry, I'll talk about that in a second, excuse me. It also has very significant bureaucratic capacity. So Moscow has a great ability to implement the policies that it has decided to implement. The Moscow Apartment Renovation Project is a great demonstration of that. So this is a project where they surveyed all of the residential housing stock in the city. Moscow is also, by territory, one of the largest cities on earth, and it has over 12 million people living in it. So that's not a small project to survey this housing stock. And then identify about 10% of that housing stock for demolition, and then they were going to resettle residents of those buildings in brand new city constructed high rises. So Moscow definitely has the ability to create a policy and implement it if it so wishes. It also has very high repressive capacity, which is of less concern to this immediate project, but it has, for example, the largest police force in Russia, among other things. In collecting data about the concessions, I did not become aware of any cases where the city made a promise that was not, at least in principle, deliverable. I also corroborated this in interviews with activists during my field work. As one said, I did not know of a single case where they sincerely wanted to do something and did not. And I've also added that the promises that they made were pretty circumscribed and tightly aligned with what the protesters are demanding. So they're not promising things to these people that are ridiculous or outside the realm of rational expectation for a government like this. So the data set that I collected, Protest Campaigns of Moscow, again, looks at municipal level protest activity. So these are protest campaigns about grievances that the city government had the authority to resolve on its own without intervention from the federal government or from private actors. Obviously, the government isn't fully acting independently of the federal government or private actors, but these are about issues that are in its purview or its authority to resolve. I collected this data from September 2013 to September 2018. This is the complete second term of the current mayor, Sergei Sobyanin. The data set includes 66 protest campaigns, 795 events, 675 unique events, and 122 concessions. So the way that I collected this, I compiled a protest event catalog of all protests held in Moscow for this period, from 4 sources: 2 opposition sort of clearinghouse sites for protest activity, the newspaper Kommersant's articles about protests and pickets, and Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty's Newswire services coverage of protests. From that event catalog, I clustered the campaigns by grievance. I clustered the protests into campaigns based on their grievance. I then identified grievances that the Moscow government had the authority to resolve. And that produced the sample of campaigns. So then for each campaign, I did additional research, completed a timeline of all events and activities. So this exhaustively documents all protests that they held with no minimum participation threshold. It also documents additional events like the ones that you were asking about. And especially it documents promises, statements from the government related to their conflict.
Yeah, hey, so sorry, this is from a couple slides ago, but when you were talking about the city of Moscow and their capacity, you don't need to go back, but it strikes me as very similar in some ways to Alicia Holland's work on like forbearance. And that's sort of in Latin America. And so the idea there is like when governments sort of don't implement their own policies to achieve some type of political aim. And so obviously her political aim is going to be different from yours. But I wonder then to what extent you think that this type of behavior is scoped to autocracies, or whether this is like a much broader phenomenon we could think about if we just sort of change what the incentives are for the state.
I don't particularly think that reneging on concessions is scoped to autocracies. Certainly, any government is capable of making false promises. In the US, for example, this is again anecdotal, I don't study democracies, but it is my impression that the government in the US is much less likely to make concessions to protesters, and people are also much less likely to get involved in these sort of very entrenched protest campaigns about local issues. But certainly any government can make false promises. The constraint in democracies is that they can be voted out of office potentially. Bureaucrats naturally can't be voted out of office, so they might be good candidates for making concessions and reneging on them in democracies. But in general, we would expect this to be a more prevalent behavior in autocracies because they lack that citizen oversight. But I don't in general think that this is limited to autocracies. The timeline of events, the sources for these, for my coding, unlike most protest or conflict data sets that rely on newspaper articles, they're looking at something like LexisNexis. I was looking at sources that were mainly created by and for campaign participants. Because these are low capacity protest campaigns, they are not getting a lot of media coverage. Obviously, to be included in this sample, they had to have received at least one notice or some coverage in at least activist-oriented news sources. But most of this data comes from social networking sites like the Contacte and Facebook, blogs that they maintained, and also websites that they set up to document their own activities. In addition to that, I also used government sources, online mapping software, NGO sources. I used about 50 to 200 sources per campaign. And when this data is released, I will also release the archived version of those sources. So it's just a quick look at what this data looks like, or what kind of protests were happening in Moscow at this time, with some examples in these boxes. So the two categories that I'm going to talk about most in this presentation would be city labor disputes. And again, I talked about these a little bit already. These are disputes with the city or its direct contractors, usually about non-payment of wages or working conditions. We then have construction and development protests. These are the largest portion of the campaigns that I observed. A lot of these are about infill development and trying to develop things like dvors or sort of little plots of land, because real estate in Moscow is incredibly valuable, as well as developments in public parks. And then there's also some protests about housing, about evictions and failure to provide housing to designated groups. And then these political protests, I'm going to talk a little bit about. So these are not protests about things like human rights, Ukraine, which was a popular topic during this time, political prisoners, the Putin regime, because those are issues that the Moscow city government does not have the authority to resolve. And actually, there were no protests about the tenure of Sergei Sobyanin in office, which is interesting. There was no campaign to remove him from office, and people attributed that to the fact that he's just sort of a cog in the Putin machine, and if they were to replace him, he would just be, the replacement would be the exact same thing, essentially. So these are protests about political policies. A lot of them are about also construction. The plan to build a massive statue of Saint Vladimir on the in Sparrow Hills, the 200 temples program that was building temples in public parks, or Orthodox churches in public parks around the city, and things of that nature. Okay, so in this data, I define a concession as a public statement by a government official that contains a specific commitment to enact a policy change. I'm basically using policy change as just a synonym for any kind of action that the government could undertake that would potentially benefit protesters. So yeah.
So in the previous slide, it seems like it was mostly in the first three, the city labor, construction and housing. It seems like that's about the government not doing something they're supposed to do. So does that really make, I was just thinking about that in light of your theory about the government giving a concession. It seems like these things are just, hey, you promised to do these things and you're not doing it, do it. And then the government makes a concession. But does it make sense to be determine a concession?
To call something that the government does in response to protests that meets the demands of the protesters a concession?
In this case, yeah, because they're just saying, it seems like they're just saying, hey, you're supposed to be doing this, you're supposed to pay me these wages, and you didn't.
In the gross majority of these protests, what people are asking the government to do is follow its own laws and commitments in general.
That's what I'm
Yeah.
getting at.
Personally, so the demands of the protests and the concessions that they get are different. The demands obviously are determined and formulated by the participants of the protest. What the city actually does can, hew more or less closely to that. So most of these cases, they're asking the government to fulfill its obligations, to enforce the law, to distribute housing, and the concessions that they get vary in what they actually do. There's also variation in how constraining the demands are. So there are, to use the example of one of these protests about allocating housing in line with the law that already exists. Those participants, they could have just demanded, like, give us our housing.
Yeah.
We are owed housing and we are homeless right now.
Yeah.
What that group actually demanded was a significant number of legal changes to how the housing policy operates and how the wait list for housing runs, and a variety of meetings with Putin and a variety of other things. They're not just purely motivated by like fix my one problem. Does that answer your question a little bit?
Yeah, that seems more, that's because, and on the next slide, you had this, does the government enact a policy change? But I was thinking, well, if they were just protesting and saying, you need to do what you said you were going to do, then they don't need to enact a change to respond with a concession.
Well, it would be a change in that it's a deviation from their current behavior. Again, I'm using policy change here sort of as a stand-in for all of the types of actions that the government can undertake that would potentially benefit protesters. And so this can also include things that people aren't asking for at all. That is, this is actually a question that I get relatively often studying concessions, is like, isn't it just distribution? Aren't they just giving money to people who protest? No, they are not. That basically never happens in this. There are only maybe like 3 cases where they try to give people things that they didn't ask for or want. I think one of them, there was a big protest campaign at Moscow State University around the World Cup because they were going to have the fan zone watch party set up there during final exams. And they tried to give away a bunch of free tickets to the games, and the students were like, this doesn't help us. We're trying to get you to cancel the fan zone.
Yeah, okay, got it.
Okay. So to identify concessions, I'm looking for a specific commitment. I'm looking for a statement that the government made that commits to a particular action or policy change. Once I've identified that change, I can evaluate it over time using that timeline that I created. And then I'm going to estimate the implementation in various periods up to, in the original data, up to 4 years. In this project, I'm only using up to 2 years. And then from that implementation data, I can create a variable of reneging. So again, reneging is the deliberate failure to implement a concession as promised. And in this data, I'm coding reneging as occurring if at any point in the 2 years after the concession, it had no or negligible effect on real world behavior and policy, with no evidence that they were still taking steps to implement it. This is actually a pretty weak threshold for the government to clear. They really just had to be doing sort of more than nothing, or even having it be a work in progress during this period. And because I'm looking only within 2 years, because I'm limiting this to 2 years, that's reducing the sample to 115 concessions. That's because there are some concessions that are actually underway for 2 years, and also because there are cases, as you suggested, where the concession is sort of canceled before it really has a chance to be implemented. So I determine if a concession is constraining as followed. So again, constraint, this is whether or not the government, the concession, if implemented, would limit or constrain the government's actions beyond the present conflict. Did you have a question?
Yes. Is there like some degree of like blame shifting? Because if it's a government policy, right, then there may be like a politician who promises something. We will. And there are like some bureaucrats on lower levels, and the politicians have like the temptation to say, oh, like the solution is underway, but this is just how the system works. This is how the bureaucrats on the lower level is trying to process your case. Or so like, do you track where the stall happens, and like how maybe the public government officials react to like allegations of this?
So because I can't see what is happening inside the government that leads to these policies not being implemented, I cannot determine if there was just sort of like a bottleneck at the lower level where they didn't manage to do this. However, I think that's pretty unlikely in most of the cases. Excuse me. I do have data about who is promising the concession and what level of government they are at. That I can talk about that a little bit at the end. I have a slide on that as well, but there's really no difference at what level of government the concessionary promise is more or less trustworthy. So it's not the case that lowest level officials are better at getting things done or worse at getting things done than even like Duma deputies. Yeah. Okay. So I have this coding of the type of action that the concession promises that I'm going to use to operationalize constraint. And I expect that you will have some questions about this as well. So constraining concession commits the government to reform, which is a formal change in the law, regulation, procedure, the written law. So to return to a previous example, that would be like changing the labor law to make it more difficult to create terrible working conditions, for example. And these also can pertain to enforcement, which is about the application of the law, a regulation, policy in a particular case in a way that is more or less enduring. So I mentioned earlier there are a lot of conflicts about land use, and I gave the example of zoning land so that it's a protected site in some way. That is an enforcement decision that applies the law to that particular plot of land, but it has sort of enduring power. That land is now zoned into the future unless the government undertakes in some way to change that zoning. Okay, so people have some questions about enforcement, but usually what I'm trying to, enforcement might not be the best term for it. What I'm trying to get at here is an application of the law or regulation in a case that resolves, that determines the, are you gonna ask a question about this?
Yeah, I mean, I'll say the question. This is what I got.
I shouldn't have done that. I don't really want people to ask questions about this, but
okay, so so I like this distinction, and this is useful in view of the question beforehand of things, and it does seem like, but I'm trying to understand where if the concession is, okay, we're going to change our jurisdiction on this, but give us time, it's gonna take 3 months to get the necessary paperwork through. Why is that something that should be more credible, that it couldn't just be, oh, you know, the deputy director of the center, when we went to go file the paperwork in a month and a half from now, didn't approve it and came back, like, or are you actually talking about like, no, like there's some piece of paper that's produced that shows a judge has ruled to actually change the legal application, you know, the designation of this particular land plot or something like that?
so I will say that in a lot of these campaigns, the organizers are looking for that piece of paper, especially with land disputes. I mean, people that I talked to during field work told me repeatedly that, you know, like nothing is settled until you get that document in your hands and it has like the stamps, the signatures and all of that. So they do view these enforcement decisions as binding. And I think Russia also is a case where obviously the rule of law is weak and highly manipulable in Russia, but it still has some force, I would say, in that oftentimes when the government commits itself to engaging in some kind of a hearing policy, it has to at least pretend to be doing it, usually.
I guess what I'm sort of pointing at is this, the commits in both of those things. So it sounds like in your explanation now, you're saying it's like constraining if the concession implements something.
Yeah. My definition of a concession is that it's a promise. So it's the concession is characterized by the promise to do something, not actually doing the thing. So the concession is characterized by a promise to, for example, to formally change the law to do X, and then later that can be fulfilled or not. But once that promise has been made to protesters, a concession is occurring by my definition.
Distribution isn't under the constraining because it's a promise to do something.
Well, let me explain it to you now. So these are all, I mean, these are all promises to do something.
Right.
That's what we're looking at here. We're looking at different promises to do something. So the non-constraining concessions are as follows. So the promise to meet with or consult with the campaign, and sometimes that is a promise to consult with the campaign in a year or indefinitely, but these promises don't actually involve doing anything with that information once you've collected it. So it's purely to ask people what they think, and then there you go, you have that information, or to have them come to like the City Duma for a meeting. That's actually very common, but those meetings don't obligate them to do anything after that. They've fulfilled their promise, they had the meeting. Similarly, investigation. This is an official inquiry into the grievance, and that can be a judicial investigation or otherwise. But holding an inquiry doesn't actually obligate you to hold anybody responsible in a meaningful way unless you want to. You can. It's just purely to ask questions about what's going on. It doesn't actually constrain anyone's options or actions in the future. You might not even find anybody responsible. Distribution, in the cases in this data set, the distribution is highly specific, and this is separate from something like political co-optation, where you're exchanging over a long period benefits in exchange for political support. They're promising a specific benefit that you can then tell if that benefit has been transmitted. So it's things like paying wages, allocating an apartment. In one case, they said they were going to provide like extra thick windows to an apartment building that was near a highway that was going to be constructed, something of that nature. So that doesn't prevent them from making a lot of noise on the highway. It doesn't really change anyone's behavior in government. It just gave some people some windows and doesn't really affect anyone's behavior in the future. Does that answer your question?
Sort of.
Okay.
I mean, it answers my question.
Okay, well, we can talk about it.
Israel? You can unmute yourself now.
I just had a small clarificatory question. So, because when you first started discussing this, I thought the difference between I thought the thing that made enforcement constraining is the fact that there's like an official documented process, but in principle, right, there's an official documented process for investigation. So I guess my question is, and maybe you're going to come to this on the next slide. So one, are there cases where there were like serial concessions? So like the concession is, we will investigate your claim. If your claim is correct, we will enforce it, right? And then how do you deal with that, both in terms of the promise, but then in terms of the eventual, like, does somebody get blamed? A, and B, are there cases of enforcement with no investigation or inquiry? And if so, what do those look like? I'm just trying to understand like the way things get coded, I guess.
So there are definitely cases where they do an investigation and the investigation comes to nothing. When they promise to do an investigation, they usually don't make additional promises specifically. I would have to look at the data and the exact wording that they're using, but I mean, they don't do things like promise to investigate and find somebody guilty, because that would violate the rule of law. They usually are promising to investigate and then, take necessary steps afterwards. I actually, frankly, don't recall off the top of my head what goes on with these investigations, but as I'll show in a second, the investigations are not usually affected by reneging. They're pretty easy for the government to achieve. Sometimes after the investigation is over, they'll make a second concession that says like, well, we'll now take these steps. Can you actually repeat your question about enforcement?
Well, no, I mean, because like the reason this all matters, right, is I'm just trying to think about like what the structure of the analysis would look like. And so the question here is if investigation necessarily precedes enforcement, or if they're like completely uncorrelated, right, with each other, right? Because otherwise it means you have to do certain things to the structure of your data. And I guess this is kind of a follow-up on Josh's question, right? I think I understood the answer, but like enforcement here is like literally like this law will be applied in this way, this person will pay this fine, right? Like that kind of thing. And so again, like, yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Enforcement is about the application or decisions to enforce laws, policies, and regulations in certain scenarios. So it is not the result of an investigation. Usually, I'm trying to think of an example. So for example, one of the concessions that's coded as enforcement, they closed like the oldest school for the blind in Moscow, where they changed where it was located administratively in the Department of Education. There was a protest about this, and they said that they would, actually, I don't know, maybe that's reform. And then they reverted it to where it had previously been bureaucratically located. So they are not doing an investigation. They're simply changing the policies that are governing the school. That was a bad example. Let me see if I can think of another
I mean,
one.
so is it but I think, right, like, so it's fair to say that the enforcement is like they actually did a concrete thing, right? Like
They're
that
promising
resulted
to
in
do a concrete thing.
yes, as
These are all
opposed to investigation,
promises to
which
do
is
these
we will
things.
figure out what's going on. Is that
Yeah.
fair? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Good enough.
Okay, so demobilization, for that second hypothesis, I'm just looking at if the protest campaign's activity decreased in the 30 days following the, in the period following the concession with comparison to that period previously. So I looked at 30, 60, and 90 days before and after the concession. I'm just going to use the 30-day period here because this variable is subject to censoring, and I want to make sure the sample size is as large as possible. So this is a 1 if they decreased their protest incidents after the concession. And then I have some controls about the history of the campaign, its capacity, which I'm measuring at average turnouts at demonstrations, pickets, strikes, events that require mass participation to occur, and the number of events they held for years that they were active, their government allies, how confrontational their tactics were, and then also exogenous variation. And so here's some just descriptive information about the data. There are 115 concessions, 56% of them, or 57% of them were constraining concessions. 50% of those concessions, of all concessions were followed by demobilization compared to the previous 30 days. And reneging occurred in 44% of cases. Concessions were on average given after 8.7 events, but actually this is sort of average is being increased by some concessions that were given by quite a larger number of events. There were 44 campaigns that received concessions that are in this data. On average, they were holding 6 events a year with 229 people in attendance. The campaigns got an average 2.7 concessions. And then we see here some other data about the government allies and tactics. So looking at some results, just again, descriptively, if we look at the types of concessions as I've classified them by high and low constraint, there is a clear difference in the incidence of reneging. So low constraint concessions are affected by reneging only in about a third of the time. So the majority of these concessions are actually being implemented to some extent in the following 2 years, whereas the high constraint concessions, 53.8% of those are undermined by reneging within 2 years, and that's particularly true of those concessions of enforcement. So looking at some regressions, this is just the coefficient plot of the models where the outcome is reneging, and as we can see from these models at the top, constraining concessions were significantly more likely to be affected by reneging. And actually none of these other variables had a particularly consistent or a statistically significant effect on that. Looking at the effective demobilization rate, that's if they demobilized in the period following the concession. This, counter to the expectation of the hypothesis, demobilization is associated with a lower rate of reneging. So campaigns that demobilize are actually more likely to see their concession implemented. So there's no evidence here that staying mobilized actually helps compel the government to implement a concession that it didn't want to implement. To take a closer look at this, so if we look at the effect sizes, they're roughly the same. So a high constraint concession, reneging is 70% more likely to happen in that case. Whereas in cases where protest is decreased for 30 days, reneging is 70% less likely. So what this suggests is that if a campaign gets a high constraint concession, even if they decrease protest, they're still going to have basically an average rate of reneging. They can't really affect reneging if they're getting a high constraint concession by demobilizing. In other words, so if we look at this case where we have a high, these are just some percentages of the sort of typologizing these 115 cases of concessions. So if you get a high constraint concession and you don't decrease protests, you're gonna 62.8% of concessions are gonna be affected by reneging. But if you do decrease protests, you still have a 44.8% chance of reneging affecting your concession. And that's quite different when we're looking at these lower constraint concessions, where if you decrease protests and you have a lower constraint concession, Reneging only affects 17.2% of those.
So you're saying they're much less likely to.
This is the percentage of concessions affected by reneging.
Right, but they're much more likely to renege if you keep protesting.
Yeah,
That seems really counterintuitive, right? Like,
doesn't it?
yeah,
Let's go on.
okay. Tara's got a question as well.
Okay.
Great. This is really interesting. So I just wanted to clarify, when you say sort of, when the government's deciding how to respond to these small scale protests, are they sort of looking down the game tree and saying, well, we can renege on this, so let's just, have these, like impose these concessions with constraint or constrained concessions, whatever you want to call them, right? And so are they sort of picking strategically between this constraint versus no constraint, and then what you're doing is sort of validating assumptions, or you think that this is sort of somehow idiosyncratic, or you've sort of mopped up whatever noise there is, and so this is sort of as if random?
So I do think that government agents who promise concessions to these protesters, they are doing so strategically. They're absolutely strategic actors who are making these promises with specific goals in mind. It's not random. I mean, nothing is random. Actually, basically everything here is endogenous, which I'm going to talk about in a second. So it's not like they're randomly choosing to make a constraining or a non-constraining concession, just like protesters aren't randomly deciding to increase or decrease protesting. Actually, that's like slightly more random, but in general, these are all strategic actors who are reacting strategically to each other and to the environment. And I'm going to talk about that more right now, actually. So some of these dynamics are actually endogenous to, or very likely endogenous to, other features of the campaign. So this is sort of a reduced categorization of the graph that I showed you a couple of slides ago. This is just the campaigns that are in this data set. We have 17 that are about construction, 12 that are about city labor conflicts. Those are the two that I'm going to focus on for the rest of this talk. So there are some differences in features of these types of conflicts that are affecting the kind of concessions that they get and their mobilization.
Okay, we have a question from Denise.
Yeah, sorry. Can you please go back one slide? So basically, yeah, so basically you're saying that if people keep protesting, the probability of reneging goes up, right?
Yeah.
So, and this is like decrease in protest for 30 days. You mean 30 days after the first protest, 30 days after like some sort of reneging? What's the timeline here?
It's 30 days. It's a comparative variable. So it's comparing the 30 days before the concession with the 30 days after the concession. And this isn't reducing, it's not fully demobilizing or decreasing protests to zero, although that does happen in a number of cases. It's a comparative variable. So it's if they decrease protests with respect to what they were doing before. And these results, I will say, they're the same for 30, 60, and 90 days before and after the concession.
So, so the concession is a promise, right? It's not necessarily implemented, right?
Right.
So suppose I make a promise, then so people keep protesting for 30 days. Oh, and then I'm still more likely to renege if people keep protesting for 30 days than if they stop protesting. Is that what you're saying?
So one way that you might think about it, and a way that I will be thinking about this more in the future, is that the concessions are kind of bargaining between protesters and the government. So I'm speaking somewhat off the cuff here, but so if the government promises you a concession that will resolve your grievance, the government may then expect you to go home, leave them alone while they try to resolve this problem, which they've told you they're going to fix it. Why are you still protesting? This is, I'm actually going to be doing a survey in early next year, hopefully, of protesters in Moscow to see how they understand that kind of bargaining. But it is possible from the perspective of the government that that's what they would like people to do when they are giving them or making them these promises. We've made you the promise, now you need to stop protesting and let us get on with whatever we would like to be doing.
Okay, thank you.
And then, of course, if that bargain is broken and you continue to protest, there is, potentially less desire on the part of the government to actually fulfill those promises, although it might also just be, as I've argued, that they never intended to fulfill them in the first place. Okay, so looking at some of the campaign dynamics. So these are some models that are basically just the relationship between the type of campaign or the grievance that the campaign is about and the three variables of concern in the previous analysis. These are all with comparison to protests about labor. So I want to draw your attention to the protests about construction and also the protests about political issues have really similar dynamics. So we see both those types of protests. They're much more likely with comparison to labor protests to get constraining concessions. So they're much more likely to get concessions that are about reform or enforcement. They're also less likely to demobilize after those concessions are made. And then they are in turn more likely to get reneging. By the same token, labor protests are likely to get lower constraining concessions. They're a lot more likely to demobilize, and they're much less likely to see reneging. So what is potentially going on with that? So there are some unique features of labor protests that make them somewhat different from the other municipal protests that I'm looking at. They're a lot more likely to make demands that are not constraining. So the demands that these campaigns make from the beginning are often for investigation and distribution. 50% of the labor campaigns made 0 demands related to reform or enforcement. No other campaign type made no demands related to reform or enforcement. 25% of labor campaigns, only 25% demanded both a concession about reform and a concession about enforcement. And that was true of 82% of the construction campaigns. And I'm going to be using construction campaigns as the comparison here. So they're making more constraining demands from the beginning. They're less likely to receive a constraining concession because they're not asking for them, probably. So only 17% of the concessions to only 17% of the concessions to labor protests made constraining concessions, whereas 63% of the concessions to construction campaigns did constrain government behavior. They're also more likely to get concessions that address their core motivating grievance to resolve the core issue. And I can talk a little bit more about how I measured that later. But 59% of these concessions were about the core motivating grievance that got people protesting in labor disputes in the first place, whereas that's only true of 48% of concessions to construction campaigns. And then last, they're also a lot more likely to demobilize following the concession. So 71% of these concessions were followed by demobilization from a labor campaign. And that's only true of 44% of the concessions to construction campaigns. So obviously something pretty different is going on with the labor campaigns. And what I think is happening here is that there's some features of how these campaigns arise and are organized that actually may ameliorate some of the credibility problem. First, they have grievances that are really well suited to one-off conflict resolution. These campaigns are usually asking for just the payment of the wages, for example, or improvement of the working conditions by a very specific group of people. Very, very few of these campaigns made demands related to, including ones that didn't get concessions, made demands relating to the labor law in general, to the enforcement of the labor law, to other work sites that weren't their own. So they're really about these isolated conflict resolution. These demands also have very limited need for future commitment. So they're often asking to pay back wages this one time. They're not saying prevent that from ever happening again. And actually there are cases where it happens repeatedly to the same group of people. So that's a particular feature. They're asking for concessions that don't have as bad of a commitment problem as these constraining concessions. The concessions that they get are also a lot more likely to contain a timeline. The concessions that they get tend to say things like, we will pay the back wages within a month, or we will improve that working condition within 3 months, or like before the next season or something of that nature. And so what this does is it facilitates monitoring by these groups of whether or not that commitment has been fulfilled. If you think about some of the construction protests, they're asking for example, rezoning or a confirmation that land is zoned in a particular way. Although that process is supposed to be visible to the public, it's actually not in Moscow. They really don't have a whole lot of ability to check how the government is doing on achieving that concession. And then last, labor disputes, they also involve unions. Usually, these disputes actually don't involve the official unions. They involve sort of alternative unions and other labor rights advocates that can help resolve the collective action problem. On top of that, you're dealing with a limited group of people at a specific workplace who know each other, as opposed to residents of a neighborhood that might have, tens of thousands of residents. The presence of unions and these other professional or professionalized advocates can help them overcome the collective action problem by doing some of the organizational work that these individuals might not have time for. And especially it allows them to credibly threaten to strike or to hold like a one-day warning strike or something of that nature. Because they can do that, they can actually remobilize fairly quickly and easily compared to some of these like neighborhood level groups that really struggle to get people to care about their issue and turn out on the streets. And one of the interesting things about this is that the people involved in these labor disputes, the participants of these protests, are particularly politically disempowered. A lot of them don't live in Moscow, so it's not like they're getting concessions because they're a powerful voting bloc. A lot of them don't even live in the city. Some of them they're not even residents of Russia. They're guest workers. And part of actually one of the struggles that these groups that try to help them resolve these wage disputes have is that they are itinerant. So they might leave before the grievance is resolved, and then they can't be located and can't actually get the back wages if they are restored. So it's an interesting dynamic here. We have really politically disempowered individuals who are managing to get far better outcomes through their collective action, well, by one definition, than others who are maybe better educated, wealthier, more stable in many ways.
Sasha, just a heads up that we have 10 minutes left. It's late in Moscow. So
okay. So I'll just talk about some alternative explanations really quickly. As I said, there's no real variation about related to the level of the official who's making the concession. And actually Putin, there's like 3 concessions from Putin in this data set, and I think 2 of them were affected by reneging. So there's really not a lot of variation there. And then we also have this issue of cost, which is something that I need to think about more, but it's very, very difficult to kind of find any kind of consistent way to operationalize the cost of these promises and to whom that cost accrues. So I'll just leave that there. So in conclusion, concessions to low capacity protest campaigns allow the government to respond to grievances, but sometimes that response is just performative. State agents tend to prefer one-off conflict resolution, and when they offer concessions that would constrain the government or systematically resolve grievances, they're much more likely to renege. This leads protesters to actually have very little ability to affect the implementation of concessions once they've been promised. However, some campaigns are more easily addressed with one-off conflict resolution than others, and that's something that I need to continue to look into. So on that note, thank you.
Great.
Yes.
Fantastic. Thanks so much. We have time for about 10 minutes of questions of Q&A left at this point. Israel?
Sure. So I kind of so like on the one hand, like I think these results are like really interesting because you made a good comment to Josh, right? Like he's like, well, that seems counterintuitive, and you're like, I know, right? But at the same time, like for me, I don't know that it does seem that counterintuitive, and it comes back to this question about costs that you got to at the end, because like if we think about the autocrat, the sort of conventional sort of Northian Olsonian view is like we have like the centralized autocrat, right? This like unitary power, but it's certainly not the case in Russia. It's probably not the case in pretty much any contemporary autocracy. And so like one of the things that struck me and you kind of got at this when you're talking about the nature of grievances, is like the stakes of the grievances are a little bit different. Not necessarily from the perspective of like, oh, okay, if we make this, we're gonna, mess with developer X, and developer X is gonna get mad, and like, but even from the standpoint of like, if you think of the autocrat as laying down a policy, right? So like, President Putin says employers will pay their wages, right? Deripaska doesn't pay his wages, so Putin's like, sign the document and give me back my pen, right? Kind of thing. And so I'm just wondering if there's any way to think about the extent to which the original grievance is like a deviation from policy, right? So like not paying wages is a deviation from what the government expects of itself. So like there, it's like the low level guy screwed up, but I, the good czar, will fix your problem, right? I don't know necessarily how construction would fit into this. And so I was wondering if you could speak to that. Because again, if it's really a question of like stakes in this sense of like the continuation of how the central power views its policy, then it's like less surprising that they make some of these concessions, because it's like, well, we're trying to restore the natural order of things. And oh, by the way, we get to look really, responsive while we're doing it. So that's one thing I wanted to ask you about. The other thing that I'm kind of curious about is I understand from the standpoint of like, constructing a feasible study why you picked Moscow, like that makes sense, like I buy it. But at the same time, I kind of want to push you a little bit on the external validity of it, because you mentioned at some point, well, there's no evidence that there was a question about whether like, the sort of top-down dynamic matters, and you answered it as like, well, we don't have evidence that Putin kind of jumped in and changed people's concessions. And obviously I know you can't, get into the head of anybody in the Kremlin, but like you could imagine situations where sort of an opposite thing happens. So there's a desire to make a concession, but because there's a policy that, like we don't negotiate with terrorists, we don't give in to protesters, right? There's sort of the inability to make certain types of concessions, because again, if you think about the sort of central policy of the autocrat, right? One is sort of socially, what do they want to do? But another one is just like, these are the kinds of things that you local level guys are allowed to do. And these are the things that make the rest of us look weak, so don't do those. And so I also wonder, the reason I bring this up is I wonder what happens when we take your sort of findings and we apply them to a less idiosyncratic region than Moscow. So we go to like, I don't know, like Leningradsky or Tuva or something like that. And I also wonder if we see similar dynamics at the federal level. And again, this comes back to this question I asked you about stakes, because if it's really about like the stakes for the autocrat, not for the for the actual continuity of their policy and the way they envision the regime, then it could be the case that part of the solution to the puzzle is really like Moscow municipal stuff is generally relatively low stakes. And so they're able to reap the benefits of at least performative responsiveness, if not actual responsiveness, without worrying too much about the concessions. But if we were to, take this and apply this to like large scale, like the mining strikes that happened in the 90s or something that's like more federalized, we might not get the same dynamic. Thanks. Sorry for the rambling question / comment.
All right, since we have 5 minutes left, I just wanted to see if there are any other questions before Ivan, you have a question? And I'll just take both questions and then we'll do that.
I was wondering what costs such protests incur for the government, considering that they are relatively low profile, and also does the government in general assess the probability that the protests may become contagious? I mean, like it all starts with, like in some cases, like they just oppose construction of a highway, and tomorrow they are like marching on the Kremlin. I don't know. And if maybe there is some like interplay with the federal authority, where like the federal authority just wants things to be quiet and silent, and if people were sad about something in their locality, if they're becoming like more vocal and are trying to become political, this is where you want like a more credible solution to the problem. Or maybe you don't want, and this is like counterintuitive.
Okay, Sasha, we'll turn back to you with a few minutes left.
Thank you for those questions and for the questions throughout. So to speak to Israel's question about the sort of a unitary vision of the state, I think a lot of the conflicts or the grievances underlying these particular protests are not of interest to the autocrat. They're about they're not of policy interest, let's say, to the autocrat. So they're not really about enforcing federal policies or even necessarily a vision of the Russian state. They are somewhat more about, I don't know, government dysfunction that is not, we're not talking about government dysfunction that's threatening, you know, a catastrophic loss of legitimacy. We're talking about problems with sort of regular governing issues. One person I interviewed about highway construction who was organizing protests against that even said, she was like, well, I really don't want this highway to be here, but I understand the government. What are they supposed to do? They have to build a highway somewhere. I just don't want it to be here. And someone else is going to be upset if they build it somewhere else and we have traffic. But my problem is that I don't want this here. So they're not all really about things that the central government has a real agenda about. I think there are also cases where, you know, because Russia is a federal system, there are cases where protest emerges around policy that the local government has been tasked with implementing. There was a healthcare restructuring in 2014 that was extremely unpopular. And the government had the Moscow government had relatively little leeway to change the policy because they've been given a mandate by Putin to basically make the healthcare system more efficient, which obviously requires firing people and closing health clinics. They came up with other solutions to make concessions to those protesters because they didn't have the ability to change the policy itself. And those were concessions like offering unemployment assistance and financial benefits to people who were losing their jobs. So even if they have to implement something from above that they can't change the heart of the policy, they still can find ways around it. On the other hand, there are other issues specifically relating to corruption where they don't seem to have as much leeway, although I don't think that they desire it. So Moscow real estate is insanely expensive, and Putin's daughter is generally understood to be at the helm of a major development company that has received huge contracts from the Moscow city government. There are a series of protests about different campaigns about the destruction of property that was then going to be developed by her company. In those cases, it's fairly clear that there is nothing that the Moscow government can do, but also likely nothing that it would want to do to resolve those conflicts in a way that prevents that construction from happening. But yes, I agree with you that like these low stakes conflicts do allow the government to sort of reap the benefits of concessions and appearing consultative, potentially even when they are not. To Ivan's question about what costs do these really incur for the government. So these protests, they do have some capacity to disrupt governing in general. So like strikes obviously are disrupting construction in many cases. There are a lot of strikes or labor conflicts with metro workers that can be quite serious. Ambulance drivers, snow removal people, things like that. But even protests around these construction projects, they can delay construction for like years in some cases of desired projects that maybe are not part of a high political agenda, but are generating a lot of money through graft for members of the government, as well as private property, like private enterprises. There is not a huge risk of diffusion though with these. Like I said earlier, people in Moscow are just not huge on protesting, and because a lot of these are pretty isolated conflicts about specific locations or specific policies like a school for the blind or like registering kindergartners in kindergarten, there's really not, unless you're directly affected by those conflicts, people tend to simply not care. Actually, the woman who was part of this highway protest couldn't even get people on the other side of her apartment building to join her protest because their windows were not going to face the highway. So there's pretty limited risk here of these movements coming together. They've tried and they have not been successful in coming together in sort of a Muscovites' rights movement is what it's sometimes called.
All right, well, on that note, please, everybody join me in thanking Sasha for being the second speaker in the series. Fantastic to have her here today. Thanks everyone who made it this far out in Moscow for joining with us on the Monday evening. And we'll look forward to continuing the speaker series next semester. So thanks everybody, and we'll be in touch soon.
Thanks, everyone.